He was a farmer with nothing left but $82 in his pocket. In a dusty Texas auction yard, he chose hunger for himself so 2 wild horses could live. What followed was a battle against drought, storms, fire, betrayal, and his own haunted past. From sacrifice to redemption, this is the story of how one man's last dollar built a haven of freedom, where broken lives, both human and wild, found a way to breathe again. The auction yard in Amarillo, Texas, looked more like a graveyard than a marketplace that evening. The sun was sinking behind the stock pens, a dull red disk caught in the haze, painting the air with dust and shadows. Men in sweat-stained hats leaned against the rails, boots grinding grit into the earth, eyes focused not with compassion, but with the cold arithmetic of weight and price. Horses, wild, thin, and trembling, were driven into the pen with rough ropes. Their eyes rolled white, flanks slick with sweat, though the day had cooled. Each crack of the whip seemed to pull the crowd tighter, but not with sympathy, with calculation. They were measuring how much meat stood before them. Caleb Brooks kept to the back, hat pulled low, hands buried deep in the worn pockets of his jeans. He wasn't there to buy. At least that's what he told himself when he first walked through the rusted gate. He had come out of habit, the way a man haunted by old fires sometimes stands by the edge of a canyon, staring into the smoke of memory. For years he had lived quietly in Mora Valley, working soil that had long ago betrayed him, raising alfalfa in a drought-stricken land, hiding from the silence that followed him after the fire. He had lost too much already. A brother consumed in flames, a family that scattered with the years, and a farm now clinging by threads. Money was short, debt long, and winter crouched just over the horizon. He had no room for sentiment. And yet when the Mustangs came thrashing into the pen, something cracked open in him. The old stallion was easy to miss, a gray, rib-thin horse with scars puckering his shoulder, a burned mark like smoke frozen into hide. His head hung low, but his eyes held a steady defiance, the look of something that had been broken many times, but had never surrendered. Beside him, a mare stumbled, belly round, trembling with each push from the handlers. She shielded her swollen body from the crowd with small, desperate side steps, ears pinned back, her eyes wide, not with rage but with fear. Fear and something else. A fragile thread of hope. "Meat stock," one man muttered, spitting into the dirt. "Not much left on that old one," another replied. "And the mare, she won't make it through the winter, heavy like that." The numbers rang out, $10, $12, $14. A pause, then a shake of heads. Prices dropped lower than the cost of a single sack of grain. A few men chuckled, their voices low and sharp. Caleb's hand tightened around the little pouch in his pocket. The coins inside were pitiful. $82, scraped together from selling tools, from skipping meals, from holding on to pride thinner than paper. It was supposed to be his winter's lifeline: flour, beans, salt. Without it, he would face the long freeze on nothing but prayer. His chest burned with the familiar weight of dread. He had fought fire with less, he told himself. He had walked through smoke with nothing but a shovel and stubbornness. But winter was a different enemy. Winter didn't wait. The auctioneer's voice rose again, a drawl stretched thin by routine. $8 for the stallion. 9? Do I hear 9? Silence. The mare, heavy and foal. $5? 5? No takers?" Caleb looked at them both, the gray stallion, the trembling mare, and felt a sharp ache that had nothing to do with hunger. They reminded him of the men he had carried out of the fire line, their faces blackened with ash, bodies too weak to stand, but eyes still burning with the will to survive. He heard his brother's voice, carried out of memory like smoke. "You don't walk away, not when they're counting on you." His hand left his pocket. The coins clinked in his palm, loud in the hush of the pen. The sound made heads turn. Someone laughed. "What's that fool thinking? He can't feed himself, let alone a pair of half-dead nags." Caleb stepped forward anyway. His boots crunched over dust, his shoulders squared with a soldier's old habit. He set the pouch down on the wooden table. "All of it," he said, voice low but steady. "For the gray and the mare." The auctioneer blinked, then smirked. $82 for both? "That's right." "Your funeral," someone muttered. The gavel struck. The sound was sharp, final, like a door slamming shut. The crowd rippled with murmurs, mockery, disbelief, pity. But Caleb didn't hear them. His heart hammered with something between terror and relief. He had just thrown away the last thread of security he had clung to. He had just bought hunger, maybe starvation. But he had also bought 2 lives that the world had already written off. The handler shoved the ropes into his hands. The stallion met his gaze, weary but unyielding. The mare shifted, trembling, her belly brushing the rail. Caleb whispered, almost to himself, "Easy now. You're safe." The words felt strange on his tongue, like a prayer long forgotten. He tugged gently on the ropes, leading them out of the pen. The crowd's whispers followed him like nettles, but the sun had already begun to sink, stretching their shadows long across the dirt. Together, man and horses walked into the bruised twilight, toward a future none of them could yet see. And as the dust settled behind him, the thought pressed deep into Caleb's chest. He had spent his last dollar not on himself, but on hope. The road back to Mora Valley wound through dry mesas and gullies that had forgotten the taste of rain. Dust clung to Caleb, Brooks' boots settling in his lungs with each step as he led the 2 Mustangs away from the auction yard. The stallion walked slow but steady, head lowered, rope taut in Caleb's calloused hand. The mare lagged, heavy with the weight of unborn life, her breath a shallow rhythm that matched the rasp of wind over the desert. No one followed them. Only the empty sound of cicadas buzzing in weeds browned to brittle stalks. What had begun as a bargain mocked by strangers now became a pilgrimage into solitude. By the time the adobe walls of his farm appeared, twilight had given way to a sky bruised purple and blue. The house stood weary, slumped against the hill, as though time itself had pressed its shoulders down. Plaster flaked from the walls, the roof sagged where beams had rotted, and the wooden door bore the scars of decades of storms. Behind it stretched what was once a proud alfalfa field, now cracked like a broken plate, green only in memory. The acequia, once a lifeline of water carried down from the mountains, lay silent, bed choked with dust and weeds. Mora Valley had been generous to his father and grandfather, but to Caleb, it offered only a ledger of losses. He tied the horses to the rail by the old corral. Ash, the gray stallion, tossed his head once, nostrils flaring at the smell of unfamiliar soil, then stilled, watching with eyes that seemed to measure Caleb as much as Caleb measured him. Juniper shifted uneasily, hooves clattering on the dry ground, her swollen belly swaying as she turned. Caleb stroked her neck gently. "It isn't much," he murmured, "but it's what we've got." His voice caught in the silence, sounding almost foreign in a place where words were scarce. Inside, the house greeted him with emptiness. The table bore only a burlap sack with a few handfuls of beans, a strip of salt pork stiff as wood, and coffee grounds too thin to brew. He unwrapped the last loaf of cornmeal bread, its crust hard and hollow. Enough for one man to stretch through the weeks ahead, but not for 3 lives. Hunger pressed in like an old enemy, familiar and merciless. Yet when he looked out the window, saw ash standing sentinel and juniper shifting in the dusk, he felt a strange resolve settle deep in his chest. A sharp knock rattled the door. It was Lily, his niece, her figure small against the desert wind. 15 years old, camera strapped around her neck, her sneakers coated with dust from the long road. Her parents had sent her from Vermont after their marriage cracked apart, and Caleb had agreed, without thinking what another mouth would mean. She didn't smile. Her eyes, sharp and restless, scanned the corral, then fixed on him. "You bought them?" she asked flatly. "With what money?" He had no answer, only silence. Lily exhaled, shoulders dropping as though she carried her own invisible pack of burdens. She walked past him into the kitchen, setting her backpack down with a thud. "Mom said you'd take me. I didn't think you'd take them, too." The word "them" hung heavy in the air, half resentment, half curiosity. That night, the valley groaned under the weight of silence. Coyotes yipped far off, answered only by the hollow whistle of wind through bare cottonwoods. Caleb lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling beams warped with age. He heard the shifting of hooves outside, the uneasy snort of juniper, the scrape of Ash's rope against the rail. It was a different kind of company than the stillness that had haunted him for years. He turned the small silver cross at his neck, thumb rubbing its worn edges. His brother's face came unbidden, eyes shining in the glow of firelight before the smoke swallowed him whole. Caleb clenched the cross until it bit his palm. "Not this time," he whispered to no one. At dawn, he carried a bucket of water from the well, the rope creaking under its weight. Ash lowered his head, drinking slow, each swallow loud in the morning quiet. Juniper drank greedily, droplets glistening on her muzzle before falling onto the dust. Lily stood nearby with her camera, lens catching the moment in silence. She didn't say a word, but when Ash raised his head and flicked his ears at her, she lowered the camera slowly, as if acknowledging something she hadn't expected to feel. The sun rose higher, painting the valley in harsh gold. The fields stretched wide and empty, a reminder of promises unkept. Caleb's debt loomed as heavy as the mountains. But standing there, watching 2 horses breathe life into a land that had nearly forgotten it, he felt a fragile shift inside. It wasn't hope. Not yet. But something close. And as the morning light broke over Mora Valley, Caleb understood. He had brought home not just mouths to feed, but a test of whether he could still believe in saving what the world had already given up on. The first week in Mora Valley stretched long and brittle, like a fence line rattling against desert wind. Caleb rose before dawn, moving with the slow habit of a man who had been keeping himself alive on little more than routine. The 2 Mustangs filled the silence outside with restless movement, hooves scuffing against hard ground, breath steaming in the cool mornings, ropes creaking each time Ash tugged against them. Juniper's belly swayed as she shifted her weight, ears twitching at every sudden noise. They were strangers in his corral, and yet their presence already pressed into the rhythm of the farm like new scars pressed into old wood. Caleb didn't rush them. He knew the look in their eyes, the whites flashing wide, muscles tight as bowstrings. Fear like that was not to be broken with force. He had seen the same stare in men pinned by fire, frozen between running and collapsing. So he did what he had done then. He stayed near, steady and quiet. At night he sat on the old corral rail, hat low, arms draped over his knees, letting the minutes spool out without demand. He didn't speak. He simply breathed with them. Sometimes Ash paced circles, rope jerking with sharp tugs. But when Caleb didn't flinch or move, the stallion slowed, nostrils blowing hard, until his circling became watching. Inside the house, Lily watched from the window, camera strap wrapped tight around her fingers. She didn't understand why her uncle would sit so long, staring at animals that looked at him like enemies. "You're wasting your time," she muttered under her breath, though there was no one to hear. But each evening, she found herself leaning against the sill longer, her lens fogging slightly from her own breath as she tried to capture the moment Ash's ears flicked forward instead of back, or when Juniper lowered her head, just an inch closer to the bucket Caleb carried. On the third night, as coyotes yipped far off, Caleb scattered salt along his palm and held it across the corral rail. He didn't look at Juniper, didn't coax. The mare sniffed the air, muscles shivering as though a shadow had passed over her. For long minutes she pawed the dirt, ears swiveling back and forth. Then, as if her hunger finally overruled her terror, she stepped forward, nostrils flaring. Her lips brushed his hand, quick and trembling, before she jerked back. Caleb didn't move, didn't speak, just let the crystals dissolve into her need. When she returned, slower this time, and licked the last of the salt, something shifted in the silence. A wall cracked, ever so slightly, and trust seeped through like water finding a fissure in stone. Ash, however, remained a sentinel of suspicion. The burn scar on his shoulder caught the moonlight, a pale reminder of pain. Each time Caleb moved too close, Ash lunged back, ears flat, eyes hard. Caleb didn't press. He knew wounds that deep required more than food or rope. They required time. Still, when the stallion lifted his head one morning at the sound of Caleb's boots on the gravel path, ears tilting instead of pinning, Caleb felt the first flicker of acknowledgement. It was not acceptance, not yet, but recognition. Meanwhile, the valley whispered its discontent. A neighbor stopped by, leaning over the fence with a shake of his head. "Those wild ones'll eat what little you've got left. Better off selling them now before they break something." Caleb only nodded, his eyes fixed on the mustangs. He had no words to give, not to the man, not to anyone. Lily overheard, and later snapped, "He's right, you know. You can't save everything." Caleb turned to her, face weathered, voice soft but immovable. "I don't have to save everything, just what I can reach." That night, Lily sat on the porch, camera in her lap, listening to the steady crunch of hooves and the low snort of horses shifting in the corral. She didn't raise the lens. For once, she simply watched. The silence of Mora Valley, once suffocating, was filled with new sounds, uncertain, uneasy, but alive. She thought of her parents, voices raised, promises broken, and realized that maybe what her uncle was doing wasn't madness. Maybe it was the only way he knew how to keep breathing. When Caleb finally rose from the rail, brushing dust from his jeans, he glanced once at Ash, then at Juniper. The stallion stood tall, unyielding, but his eyes followed Caleb until he disappeared inside the house. Juniper pawed the ground, then nosed the empty rail where the salt had been. For the first time in years, the valley didn't feel like it was holding its breath. It felt like it was waiting. The first true test of Mora Valley came not with fire, but with wind. By mid-September, the sky carried a strange heaviness, the kind that made ravens circle lower and cottonwoods shiver without reason. The day had begun with a brittle calm, the kind that tricks a man into thinking the season might soften. But by afternoon, gusts screamed down off the plateau, sweeping grit and thistles across the valley floor. Dust hammered the windows, slipped through every crack in the adobe walls, and rolled in heavy waves across the dried alfalfa field. The land seemed to groan, a throat clogged with the weight of drought. Caleb was in the corral when it started. The horses felt it before he did. Juniper stamping hard, tail slashing, belly tight with unease, Ash throwing his head, eyes gone wide with the memory of storms he had carried in his scar. The stallion lunged once at the rail, muscles surging with panic, the rope biting into Caleb's hand. Caleb steadied, leaning into the pull, speaking low though the wind stole his words. "Easy, old soldier. Easy now." He knew the look, not just fear of weather, but the deeper kind, the kind that wakes ghosts. Lily ran out from the house, camera bouncing against her chest, coughing against the dust. "They're going to break through!" she shouted, hair whipping across her face. The words cut like prophecy, because the next gust split the corral latch, sending it clattering against the posts. Ash reared high, striking the sky, hooves cutting arcs of defiance. For a moment, Caleb saw not a horse, but his brother in the fire line, eyes wild, chest heaving, pinned between running and burning. His throat closed around the memory. He didn't shout. Instead, he moved closer, hand raised, palm steady. Every instinct screamed to hold tighter, to pull harder, but he remembered the rule of men trapped in smoke. Force breaks what's already breaking. He let the rope slack. Let Ash feel the choice. The stallion's chest heaved, nostrils streaming, but when Caleb's palm brushed the side of his neck, he froze, trembling like a wire in the wind. Ash's breath hitched, then slowed, just slightly, but enough. Caleb pressed his forehead briefly against the horse's shoulder, a silent vow spoken through skin and scar. Juniper, though, was another storm. Her eyes rolled white as her belly tightened, the foal inside kicking sharp against her ribs. She whinnied high and bent, sharp. The sound nearly swallowed by the wind, then crashed against the side rail, desperate to shield what she carried. Caleb turned, catching her rope, murmuring again, "Easy, girl, you're not alone." But the words were for himself as much as for her. His hands shook, not just from strain, but from the weight of what little stood between them and collapse. When the gusts finally broke, leaving the corral coated in a film of grit, the valley seemed to exhale all at once. The latch hung bent, wood splintered, dust drifting like smoke across the pen. Ash lowered his head, foam flecking his mouth, eyes still wide, but locked on Caleb as though expecting another command. Juniper shuddered, belly rippling with restless life, then pressed her muzzle briefly against the post where Caleb had steadied her. The gesture was fleeting, almost accidental, yet it carried the same weight as words. A fragment of trust formed not by calm, but by surviving the storm together. Inside, when the wind eased enough to hear her own thoughts, Lily scrolled through her camera. The images were wild and blurred, Ash rearing like a figure carved from lightning, Juniper pressed against the rail, Caleb's hand stretched steady amid the chaos. She stared at them long into the night. They weren't pretty pictures, not the kind she'd post for likes. They were raw, uneven, but true. She whispered into the glow of the screen, though no one heard. Maybe this is what saving looks like. Caleb sat at the kitchen table, dust coating his hair, his palms raw from rope burn. On the table lay a letter from the bank, its bold print a colder wind than the one that had just passed. Payment due. Final notice. He turned it face down, listening to the muffled snorts outside. For years, silence had been his punishment. Empty rooms, quiet nights, no voices to fill the hollow spaces. Now silence was filled with breath, shifting hooves, the uneasy chorus of beings that demanded something from him. And against all reason, he welcomed it. When dawn crept pale and weak over the plateau, the valley still bore scars of the storm, rails bent, dust piled in drifts, fields stripped bare. Caleb stepped outside, boots sinking in grit. Ash lifted his head immediately, ears flicking forward, no longer only with suspicion, but with recognition. Juniper moved slower, belly swaying, eyes soft with exhaustion, but steady on him. Caleb touched the rail, wood splinter biting his palm, and exhaled. The wind had tested them all, and though the valley groaned under its weight, they were still standing. He whispered to the morning, voice barely louder than breath, "We'll hold. Together." The storm that broke the valley weeks earlier had left behind a silence so heavy it pressed into bone. Caleb thought the land had settled into its usual rhythm of drought, a slow dying that stretched across seasons. But summer in Mora Valley was fickle. What it denied in rain for months, it returned in one violent night. Clouds rolled in thick and low, purple bellies dragging across the ridges. By dusk, thunder stitched itself into the sky, and the first drops spattered against the dust, each one exploding like a long-forgotten promise. At first, the rain was welcome. Caleb stood on the porch, hat pulled low, letting the scent of wet sage seep into his lungs. Juniper lifted her head, ears flicking, nostrils wide as if remembering a world where the ground wasn't always parched. Ash snorted sharply, shaking his mane, suspicious of the sudden gift. Lily darted onto the steps, camera in hand, her face lit by the rare shimmer of water catching light. "It looks alive again," she whispered, almost afraid to speak louder. For a moment, the valley felt reborn. Then the acequia, dry for months, began to roar. Water surged down its bed with a fury born of mountains, carrying branches, stones, and mud in its wake. What had been a trickle turned into a torrent, spilling over its banks, cutting new channels through the broken field. Caleb's stomach dropped. He'd seen it before. How flash floods carved without mercy, how they could sweep cattle, wagons, even men into darkness. He shouted for Lily to stay back and bolted toward the corral. Juniper was the first to panic. The rising water soaked the pen, turning dust to sucking mud. She screamed, hooves pounding, and in her terror she slipped against the broken rail. The foal inside her shifted violently, her belly tightening with each thrash. Ash rammed the far side, eyes white, as if determined to fight the flood itself. The latch Caleb had bent back into place after the black wind groaned under his weight. Caleb leapt into the pen, boots sinking deep, water dragging at his legs. He reached Juniper, grabbing the rope just as it twisted around a splintered post. The current surged, pulling her sideways, her body half submerged, her cries sharp enough to cut through the thunder. "Hold her head up," he shouted. But Lily was already there, ignoring his command to stay away. She had the flashlight clutched in one hand, beams scattering across the chaos, her sneakers vanishing in mud. Thomas Begay appeared from the dark, as if the storm had carried him. Boots planted firm, his deep voice threading through the noise with words Caleb didn't understand, but felt in his chest. He pressed his shoulder against Juniper's flank, steadying her. "Cut the rope," he barked over the roar. Caleb pulled the knife from his belt and sawed through the sodden fibers, blood from his scraped hand mingling with the rain. The rope snapped, Juniper stumbling free, crashing into Thomas, who took the weight like stone. Ash reared high, striking the storm itself, but when Caleb turned, the stallion wasn't running. He was circling Juniper, staying close, his massive body between her and the rush of water. For all his fury, there was a pattern in it. Protection, not panic. Caleb felt the breath rip from his chest. Even here, with everything trying to tear them apart, some instinct stronger than fear still held. The three of them wrestled Juniper out of the pen, into the higher ground by the barn. Her belly rippled with another sharp contraction, and Caleb's blood froze. Too soon. The foal wasn't meant to come in storms like this, not in mud and cold. Juniper trembled, sides heaving, eyes rolling. Caleb steadied her with both hands, his voice breaking against the storm. "Not yet, girl. Hold on. Please." The rain finally eased near midnight, retreating as quickly as it had come. But the damage was done. The field lay drowned beneath a sheet of brown water, the acequia carved wider than before. The corral rails sagged, broken again. Caleb sank to his knees in the mud. Juniper pressed against him, trembling but upright. Lily leaned against the barn wall, soaked and shaking, her flashlight beam still trembling across the ground. Thomas wiped water from his brow, his chest rising heavy, then looked at Caleb with an expression that carried no judgment, only recognition. "Storms don't care what they take," Thomas said quietly. "But you brought her out. That matters." Caleb couldn't answer. His palms were raw, his body aching, but what haunted him was not the wreckage of wood or soil. It was the sight of Juniper's flanks tightening in labor-like spasms, the knowledge that her foal had been pushed closer to life than it should have been. He touched her damp neck, whispering again, "Not yet, just a little longer." When morning came, the valley smelled of wet earth, a fragrance so rare it felt like a lie. But beneath the beauty lay threat. Crops drowned, fences ruined, debts deepened. Caleb walked the ruined field, water lapping against his boots, and felt the weight of loss press down harder than the flood. Yet when he looked back at the barn, saw Lily brushing mud from her camera, saw Thomas resting a hand on Ash's scarred shoulder, and saw Juniper, tired, trembling, but alive, he realized survival had already claimed a small victory. And in that fragile dawn, Mora Valley didn't feel abandoned. It felt as though the land itself was watching, waiting to see what Caleb Brooks would do next. The morning after the flood broke over Mora Valley was bright, deceptively calm, the air washed clean of dust. Birds picked at the edges of the drowned fields, their wings flashing against waterlogged soil. From a distance, it looked almost like life returning. Up close, it was ruin. Caleb stood at the edge of what had been his alfalfa crop, boots sinking in muck, the acequia cut into a wound that bled across his land. Every step he took squelched with loss. What little he had hoped to sell for winter feed had been stripped away overnight. Inside the barn, Juniper leaned against the wall, eyes heavy but alert. Her belly rippled occasionally, the foal restless inside her, but she stood steady, refusing to collapse. Ash lingered close, his scarred shoulder brushing. Against her flank, silent guardian. Caleb watched them as he fed out the last flakes of hay, his jaw tight. There were maybe 3 days left in the stack, and half the beans in the burlap sack had already spoiled in the damp. Hunger wasn't on the horizon anymore. It had arrived and sat at the table. That afternoon, he walked into the shed and pulled down the machine that had been his father's, an old but still working hay cutter. Its blades were dull, its paint chipped to the color of rust, but it was worth money, the kind of money that could buy feed if sold quick. Caleb's hands lingered on the handle, memories pressing in with every scrape of his palm against the worn steel. His father had shown him how to grease the gears one summer evening, the air thick with alfalfa scent. "This machine keeps us alive when the rain won't," he had said. And now Caleb stood staring at it, realizing he would have to trade survival for survival. Lily found him there, grease smearing his knuckles. "You're selling it?" Her voice cracked with disbelief. "Without it, how do you even grow next season?" Caleb didn't answer at first. He just wiped his hand against his jeans, leaving a dark streak, and lifted the cutter upright. "Next season doesn't matter if we don't make it through this one," he said finally, voice low, steady. Lily's camera hung against her chest, forgotten. "You're giving up," she accused. Her words weren't sharp out of cruelty, but fear, the kind of fear a child carries when everything solid begins to crumble. Caleb turned to her then, meeting her eyes. His were dark, worn, but resolute. "I'm not giving up," he said. "I'm choosing what to lose, so the rest has a chance." He loaded the cutter onto the back of his old pickup, its tires sagging under the weight. The road into town was long and rutted, but by dusk he returned with sacks of hay, bags of grain, and a roll of mineral salt. Enough to last a little while. He carried the feed into the barn, each bundle thudding against the ground like the beat of a weary drum. Ash lifted his head, nostrils flaring at the new scent. Juniper pressed closer, ears tilting forward. They didn't know the cost, couldn't know what had been given up for them. But they ate, slow and steady, and the barn filled with the sound of chewing, the sound of life insisting on itself. That night, Caleb sat at the table with Lily across from him. She pushed her food around on her plate, eyes shadowed, before blurting, "What happens when there's nothing left to sell?" The words hung heavy, daring him to answer. Caleb set down his fork, folded his hands, and let the silence stretch. Finally, he said, "Then we start again with nothing. That's what this valley taught me a long time ago." His voice wasn't bitter, only tired. Later, when Lily slipped outside with her camera, she captured a photo of Ash standing guard over Juniper in the moonlight. The stallion's ears flicked at her shutter, but he didn't shy. She studied the image on her screen. A scarred horse, a trembling mare, and the faint outline of her uncle in the background, head bowed but unbroken. She saved it, not for likes or shares, but because it felt like proof. Proof that sacrifice wasn't just loss, but the measure of how far someone would go to keep others alive. Caleb returned to the barn just before midnight. He leaned against the post, listening to the rhythm of chewing, of hooves shifting, of life that cost more than he thought he could pay. He pressed his hand to the worn wood and whispered, so soft it vanished into the night air, "You'd better make this worth it." But even as he said it, he knew the price had already been paid. And that was reason enough. The season turned brittle again. Summer's brief gift of rain had passed, leaving behind the smell of damp earth that soon vanished under the returning dryness. Mora Valley went back to its silence. Crickets chirping, coyotes calling in the night, the faint groan of wind through the cottonwoods. Caleb thought the storms had tested him enough, but the land wasn't done. In late September, smoke began to drift in from the north. At first it was a faint haze, like dust caught in the low sky. By evening it thickened, painting the horizon a bruised red. Somewhere beyond the ridges, another wildfire had taken hold. Caleb's chest tightened at the scent, his breath catching on old memories that clawed their way forward. Ash felt it too. The scarred stallion grew restless, hooves striking the dirt, ears pinned, body quivering like a bowstring drawn too tight. His fear was sharp and sudden, the kind that carried history in its marrow. That night, as the valley filled with the acrid sting of smoke, Ash broke. With a violent lunge, he snapped a rail and burst into the yard, eyes wild, nostrils flaring as if the flames themselves were chasing him. Caleb went after him without hesitation. He didn't grab the rope or shout commands. He stepped into the haze, raising his hands slowly, palms open, moving the way he once had toward men blinded by terror. "Ash," he whispered, though his voice broke against the dry wind. The stallion spun, muscles coiled, ready to fight or flee. For a heartbeat, Caleb saw not a horse, but his brother's face, the night of the fire. Eyes wide, throat choked with smoke, body caught between running and staying to hold the line. The memory gutted him. He kept walking. His heart hammered as the stallion reared, but Caleb didn't flinch. He came closer until the smell of smoke wrapped around them both, until he could press his hand against the trembling neck. Ash shook once, violently, but Caleb leaned in, forehead against the horse's scar. His voice was raw, words torn out of a place he had buried too deep. "I couldn't save him," he confessed, the words spilling into the smoke. "My brother, I pulled men out of fire. I carried. Strangers. But I left him. I left him in the flames, and I've carried it every day since." His breath came ragged, mixing with ashes, two survivors choking on the same ghost. Ash's chest heaved, but his hooves stilled. The stallion's eyes flicked, not soft, not forgiving, but steady. Caleb pressed his hand harder into the rough coat. "I can't change what I lost," he whispered. "But I won't walk away again. Not from you, not from her, not from this valley." Behind them, Lily stood frozen in the porch light, camera clutched tight, but unused. She had never heard her uncle speak of his brother. She had only known the silence that pressed on him like a second skin. Now the words poured out into the night, jagged and broken, yet truer than any story she had imagined. Her throat ached, and without thinking she whispered into the dark, "Then we stay, all of us." Caleb turned at her voice, his face lined with soot and grief, but for once he didn't hide. He nodded, slow, as if her vow had joined his. Ash exhaled. a long tremor shaking through his frame, then lowered his head against Caleb's chest. It was not surrender. It was recognition. A fragile truce forged in smoke and memory. The valley held its breath. The fire never reached them. Not this time, but the smoke lingered for days, seeping into clothes, walls, and dreams. Yet for Caleb, something had shifted. The weight he carried was no lighter, but it had been spoken aloud, and in speaking it, he no longer bore it alone. Ash had heard it, Lily had heard it, and somehow that was enough to steady him. When dawn broke, painting the sky pale and thin, Caleb walked the fence line with Ash pacing behind, Juniper watching from the barn, Lily trailing with her camera lowered at her side. For the first time in years, he felt the ache of memory without being crushed by it. The smoke still clung to the valley, but through it rose the faint scent of hay, life breathing through ash. October came with mornings cold enough to frost the edges of the cottonwoods. The smoke had drifted north, leaving behind air that tasted sharper, cleaner. But the valley wore its silence like a warning. The flood had cut scars through the alfalfa field, and the wind had splintered fence rails, but now a different battle pressed in, one written not in weather, but in paper. Caleb found the old cedar trunk buried under a tarp in the shed. He had been searching for extra blankets, but what he uncovered was something else. Yellowed papers tied with twine, stamped with seals that looked official even under layers of dust. He carried them to the table, spreading them out beneath the flicker of the oil lamp. Water rights, easements, survey maps sketched in his father's steady hand. Caleb traced the lines with a calloused finger, realization dawning like slow fire. His father hadn't left him only land. He had left him leverage. In a valley where water was more valuable than gold, the acequia carved across, his field was not just a ditch. It was power. Lily leaned over his shoulder, brows furrowed. "What does it mean?" she asked. Caleb hesitated, then tapped the seal. "It means the water that runs here doesn't just belong to the town or the companies. It belongs to us. It means we can decide where it flows." Lily tilted her head, eyes flicking toward the barn where Juniper shifted, belly heavy, Ash standing guard. "So we could use it? For them?" Before Caleb could answer, a truck rumbled up the dirt road. Dust rose behind it like a warning flag. Cole Maddox stepped out, sharp suit incongruous against the desolate landscape. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never been told no and believed he never would be. He leaned on the fence, smiling too easily. "Brooks," he drawled, "heard you've been buying mouths you can't feed. Hate to see a neighbor drown in his own charity. I could help." Caleb stayed silent, shoulders squared. Cole flicked his eyes toward the barn. "Sell me your water rights. I'll pay fair, more than fair. Enough to clear your debt and line your table through winter. You can't drink paper, and you sure can't feed those nags with it." Lily bristled, camera clicking in her hands before Caleb could stop her. Cole's smile tightened. "Cute," he muttered. Then lower, "Think about it. The valley's already chosen. You either cash in, or you'll be the one left dry." When the truck finally rolled away, silence returned heavier than before. Caleb gathered the papers back into the trunk, tying the twine firm. "Not for sale," he whispered, though the words felt like they cost him. That night, Thomas came by, drawn by Lily's hurried message. He listened as Caleb laid the documents on the table again. The farrier's weathered hands turned the papers with reverence. "These aren't scraps," he said. "They're a promise. With this, you can keep the land whole. But it's also a target. Men like Maddox don't walk away when told no." Lily crossed her arms, chin high despite her trembling. "So what do we do? Just wait for him to come back?" Thomas looked at Caleb, then at the lamp flickering between them. "No," he said simply. "You start something bigger. You turn this place into more than survival. You make it a haven." The word hung there, fragile and daring. Haven. Caleb stared at the stack of papers, then at the shadows shifting under the barn door. Juniper groaned softly, shifting her weight, Ash steady at her side. Beyond them lay fields drowned and broken, fences splintered, debts deep as the winter sky. But for the first time, Caleb felt something beyond endurance, a trace of possibility, running like water beneath the surface. He reached for the lamp, dimmed it, and said quietly, "Then we'll build it, no matter what it takes." The days after Maddox's visit pressed heavy over the valley. Caleb worked the fences with quiet determination, replacing boards splintered by wind and flood. His hands blistered and cracked, skin raw against the wood, but he kept moving. The papers with water rights stayed tucked inside the cedar trunk, a weight heavier than any stone he lifted. They gave him power, yes, but also responsibility, a burden that didn't loosen even in sleep. Lily noticed first that they were not as alone as they thought. One morning she spotted old Mrs. Ortega trudging up the path, apron dusted with flour, arms carrying 2 loaves of cornbread. "For the girl," she said, her eyes flicking toward the barn where Ash snorted. "And maybe a slice for the animals, too." She left before Caleb could thank her. That evening, a pair of young brothers brought a bundle of weeds they called horse grass, insisting their grandmother swore by it. Day by day, small offerings appeared at the gate. Scraps of hay, jars of beans, hand-me-down blankets. Each gift bore the stamp of lives as dry and cracked as Caleb's own, yet willing to share what little they had. Thomas began to linger longer at the farm. He hammered rails beside Caleb, steady and silent, the rhythm of wood and iron falling into place like a prayer. Once, as they paused to drink from the same tin cup, Thomas said, "People here, they know Maddox. They know what it means when a man comes dressed too fine to a place too poor. They've seen it before. They don't trust him any more than you do." Caleb only nodded, but the words settled deep. Ava Ramirez arrived in her dented veterinary truck, dust trailing behind her like a comet's tail. She checked Juniper, listening with her stethoscope pressed against the mare's swollen belly. "Still early," she murmured, "but stress could change that fast. She needs calm, steady food, and no more close calls." Her gaze flicked toward Caleb, sharp. "You understand?" He swallowed and gave a short nod. Ava's eyes softened, and she added, "I've seen stubborn men let animals die because they couldn't admit they needed help. Don't be one of them." Then she left a tin of supplements on the shelf without waiting for payment. Lily filmed more often now. Her lens caught moments she hadn't noticed before. Ash lowering his head when Caleb passed, Juniper leaning slightly into Lily's brushing, Thomas humming under his breath while hammering nails. She uploaded one video late at night, hands trembling as she typed the caption, "Saving what the world gave up on." She didn't expect much, but by morning, comments bloomed beneath it. Strangers offering encouragement, farmers from other states sharing their own battles, even one from Vermont. "Proud of you, Lil. Keep showing the truth." She shut the laptop quickly, but her lips curved with the smallest smile. Caleb noticed the change in her, though he said nothing. Instead, one evening, he found her in the barn, camera dangling from her neck as she leaned against Juniper's side. "You think they'll make it?" she asked softly, eyes fixed on the horse's breathing. Caleb stood in the doorway, hat in hand, and after a long pause replied, "They have to, because I said I'd stand with them." Lily glanced at him then, studying his face with the curiosity of someone finally beginning to believe. By the end of the week, the corral stood patched and stronger, the barn roof mended with boards donated from half a dozen neighbors. The valley had not suddenly turned generous. Everyone still fought their own hunger, their own debts. But something about Caleb's stubbornness drew them in. The dry hands of Mora Valley, cracked and scarred, had reached out together. That night, Caleb walked the fence line under a thin crescent moon. Ash followed a few steps behind, ears tilted forward, Juniper resting nearby with Lily seated cross-legged beside her. Caleb's chest ached with exhaustion, but for the first time, it wasn't hollow. He whispered into the dark, barely audible, "Maybe we're not alone after all." The words drifted into the cool night, carried on the faint trickle of the acequia. The valley, scarred and weary, seemed to listen. The first signs came in silence, an unease in the air, a strange stillness that settled over Mora Valley like a warning. Dogs barked without reason, owls abandoned their perches. Caleb noticed Ash pacing near the gate, nostrils wide, ears flicking sharply toward the ridges. Juniper shifted restlessly in the barn, her swollen belly quivering as if sensing danger before it arrived. Even Lily felt it, glancing up from her camera to the sky, where clouds gathered without stars. By midnight, the wind rose. Not the screaming gusts of the Black Plateau storm, but a steady, smothering gale that pressed against the house and barn with suffocating weight. Caleb stepped outside, lantern in hand, and the darkness met him like a wall. There were no stars, no moon, only the black breath of sky swallowing every light. He tightened his grip on the lantern, flame trembling inside the glass. It was then he heard it, the splinter of wood. The far fence had been cut clean through, rails sagging in the wind. He cursed under his breath, heart pounding. Maddox. The thought was enough to send blood rushing hot through his veins. He sprinted across the yard, boots sinking in dust, lantern swinging. Lily stumbled after him, ignoring his shout to stay back. Beyond the broken fence, Ash and Juniper had slipped into the night. Their silhouettes flickered for a heartbeat against the black, then vanished into the sagebrush. Caleb ran, lungs burning, voice breaking against the gale. "Ash! Juniper!" The sound carried nowhere, swallowed whole by the dark. Panic clawed at him, not just for the horses, but for the unborn foal whose life hung by the thinnest thread. Thomas appeared out of the night like a figure carved from the earth itself. He carried only a rope and the calm of a man who had chased storms before. "They won't get far," he said, though his breath came quick. "Not in this dark." Together, the three of them pushed into the brush, lantern light casting wild shadows across the ground. The chase felt endless. Each sound, the crack of branches, the thud of hooves, pulled them deeper. Caleb's chest burned, but he pressed forward, refusing to let the dark take them. He thought of the flood, the smoke, the wind, every test the valley had thrown, and knew this was different. This was no storm. This was the hand of a man trying to break what he couldn't own. At last, a shrill whinny cut through the night, sharp and terrified. Lantern light caught Ash rearing near a narrow ravine, his massive frame outlined against nothingness. Juniper stumbled nearby, hooves skidding dangerously close to the edge. Caleb's heart clenched. He dropped the lantern, its flames sputtering as he raised his hands to his mouth and whistled, the 2 short notes he had used again and again. The sound cut through the chaos. Ash froze, ears snapping forward, his body trembling with indecision. Caleb whistled again, softer this time, steady as a heartbeat. The stallion snorted, then stepped back, away from the ravine, muscles quivering but controlled. Juniper followed, sides heaving, her belly brushing against the brush. Caleb rushed forward, rope catching in his hands as he looped it around Ash's neck. "Easy, old soldier," he whispered, voice ragged. "I've got you." They led the horses back under the weight of silence. The lantern flame finally died, leaving only the thin glow of dawn breaking on the horizon. By the time they reached the barn, the valley still felt starless, heavy with threat, but the animals were safe. Caleb leaned against the gate, chest heaving, sweat cold against his skin. Lily lowered her camera, which she had forgotten she carried. Her eyes glistened as she looked at her uncle. "He came back when you called," she said softly. Caleb met her gaze, exhaustion etched deep into his face. "Because I didn't stop calling," he answered. Inside, as Juniper settled into straw, Caleb sank onto the rail, rope still wrapped in his hand. The night had stolen their stars, but it had given him something else. The certainty that trust, once earned, could guide even through the darkest hours. The night of the broken fence left everyone drained. Caleb barely slept, though exhaustion dragged at his bones. He sat on the porch until dawn, with the rope still looped around his hand, staring out at the valley, as if Maddox himself might step from the sagebrush. When the first light cut across the land, it felt less like a sunrise and more like a warning. Danger had not passed, only shifted. In the barn, Juniper lay heavily in the straw, her body trembling with the strain of carrying too much for too long. Caleb knelt beside her, brushing the damp from her coat. Her belly rippled with sharp contractions, though Ava had said the foal wasn't due for weeks yet. Caleb's heart stuttered as he felt the muscles tighten under his palm. "Not now," he whispered, his words more plea than command. But the mare's body had its own clock, and it ticked faster with every hour. Ash stood nearby, pacing like a restless sentinel. His scarred shoulder brushed the stall door each time he turned, his eyes sharp and unblinking. He seemed to understand more than Caleb could say, that something fragile was breaking open inside this barn, and it was his duty to hold the walls against the world. By afternoon, Ava Ramirez's truck rattled into the yard, tires spitting dust. She strode into the barn, stethoscope swinging from her neck, her face set in professional calm. Lily hovered close, camera forgotten at her side. Ava crouched by Juniper, listening to the mare's labored breaths. After a long silence, she glanced up at Caleb. "It's early, too early, but she's not going to stop now." Caleb swallowed hard. "What does that mean?" "It means you're going to have 2 lives in your hands before this day is over." The hours blurred into a haze of motion. Caleb boiled water over the wood stove, tore old sheets into strips, and laid them near the stall. Lily brought lanterns, and tried to keep her hands steady, though her eyes betrayed fear. Thomas arrived as dusk fell, his voice a calm anchor in the storm of panic. He placed one broad hand on Juniper's side, murmuring low in words older than the valley itself. When the labor hit, it came like a wave. Juniper cried out, hooves striking the boards, body quivering with effort. Caleb knelt by her head, stroking her mane, whispering whatever words rose from memory. "You're not alone. Easy, girl, easy." Ash pressed close, snorting sharply each time Juniper strained, as if trying to lend her his strength. The foal's arrival was messy, raw, terrifying. For long moments, nothing happened but struggle. The mare's body racked with pain, Caleb's hands shaking, Ava's voice firm and steady guiding him through. Then, with one final effort, the barn filled with a thin, gasping whinny. A fragile, wet-coated foal slid into the world, legs tangled, chest heaving for breath. Caleb caught him in his arms, his heart nearly breaking at the tiny weight. For a moment, time froze. The foal lay still, head heavy in Caleb's hands. He pressed his palm against its chest, praying for movement. Then a sudden inhale, shallow, desperate, but alive. The sound ripped through the barn, small, yet thunderous. Caleb laughed once, broken and raw, tears blurring his vision. "Breathe," he whispered fiercely. "Breathe, damn it." Juniper groaned, exhausted, but lifted her head to nuzzle the foal. Ash stepped closer, eyes wide, a low rumble echoing in his chest. Together, the three of them surrounded the newborn in a circle of heat and breath. Lily stood back, hands covering her mouth, the camera forgotten at her feet. She had never seen life arrive so close to death, had never felt the air shift so completely in one moment. Caleb laid the foal gently against Juniper's side, his own hands trembling with relief. The tiny chest rose and fell, each breath shaky but insistent. Ava exhaled, wiping sweat from her brow. "He's small," she said, "but he's strong enough. If he keeps fighting, he'll make it." Night deepened, but the barn glowed warm with lantern light and the sound of breathing. Juniper's heavy sighs, Ash's steady rumble, the fragile rhythm of the foal, and Caleb's own ragged exhale. The valley outside remained dark, starless still, but in this small circle, light burned stubbornly against the night. Caleb leaned back against the stall, exhaustion flooding him. He watched as Juniper curled her neck around the foal, as Ash lowered his head in silent watch. He felt Lily's hand slip into his, trembling but firm. Together they listened to the sound that mattered most, the breath of two lives, new and fragile, but defiantly alive. The foal survived its first fragile night. By dawn, he was already wobbling to his feet, legs splayed like sticks of kindling, determination stronger than his trembling frame. Caleb watched him lean against Juniper's flank, suckling greedily, and felt the ache in his chest ease for the first time in months. The barn smelled of straw and new breath, a fragile miracle stitched together by exhaustion and stubborn faith. Yet outside, the world was less forgiving. The valley, scarred by storms and debt, still demanded its toll. And Maddox had not disappeared. 2 days later, his truck rolled up the lane again, tires spitting gravel. This time he wasn't smiling. He carried papers in a neat leather folder, the kind of documents that never came without sharp teeth hidden in their words. Caleb stood at the gate, arms crossed, Ash behind him like a shadow of muscle and defiance. Maddox tapped the folder against the fence. "It's simple," he said, voice smooth as oil. "These animals are liabilities. You don't have the feed. You don't have the money. And without water, you don't even have a farm. Sell me your rights. Let me take the weight off your shoulders." Caleb's jaw clenched. "The water isn't yours to take." Maddox's smile returned, thin and sharp. "Not yet. But paper changes that. And I've got plenty of paper." Before Caleb could answer, Lily stepped forward, camera raised. She didn't film Maddox's face. She captured the scene. Ash's ears pinned, Caleb's hand steady on the rope, the folder glinting in the sun like a blade. Maddox scowled. "Careful, girl. You don't know what you're poking." Thomas appeared from the barn, dust streaking his shirt. He glanced at the folder, then at Maddox. "He's not bluffing," Thomas said quietly to Caleb. "Men like him know how to use the law like a noose." Caleb nodded once, then walked into the house. When he returned, he carried the old cedar trunk he laid the sod, papers across the fence, spreading maps, seals, and signatures beneath the open sky. Maddox leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "These are rights signed by the state. They give me control of the acequia through this land. My father kept them, and now they're mine," Caleb said, voice low but steady. Maddox sneered. "Paper that old won't stand, not against money." But Caleb had been preparing. He had sent word through Lily's growing network of online supporters, and Ava had contacted a friend in Santa Fe who knew the law. Within hours, a lawyer from Albuquerque drove up in a dusty sedan, briefcase in hand. He scanned the documents, adjusted his glasses, and said clearly, "These rights are binding. Unless you're willing to fight the state itself, you can't touch his water." Maddox's face tightened, but he masked it quickly. "Enjoy your victory," he said, snapping the folder shut. "But this valley doesn't keep secrets long. You'll find the cost of defiance higher than you think." He turned and left, his truck spitting dust down the road. Caleb gathered the papers back into the trunk, his hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of what had just passed. For the first time, he understood that the valley's future wasn't just about feed or fences. It was about the river that cut through it, the water that fed fields, families, and now his small haven of horses. It was about claiming the right to decide, not just for himself, but for everything under his care. That evening, neighbors trickled in, drawn by whispers that Maddox had been turned away. They brought jars of beans, old tools, sacks of hay. One man laid a weathered Bible on the table. "Belonged to my father," he said. "He always said water's worth more than land. You've proven him right." Caleb didn't give speeches. He only looked out at the barn where Juniper rested. Ash stood sentinel, and the foal, already testing his legs, took clumsy steps into the straw. He thought of Maddox's words, of the weight of paper and law, and felt a strange fire settle in his chest. For years he had lived under the shadow of what he couldn't change. Now, for the first time, he held something that gave him power not to be taken, but to protect. As night fell, Lily sat beside him on the porch, uploading the day's footage. "People are watching," she said softly. "Not just here, everywhere." Caleb didn't answer, but when Ash nickered from the barn and the foal whinnied back, he thought maybe the world was finally listening too. Winter pressed its breath against the valley, but Mora no longer felt like a place waiting to die. Something had shifted since the papers were spread across the fence, since Maddox's truck disappeared into a cloud of his own dust. Caleb still woke each day to chores that outpaced his strength, mending fences, hauling hay, cutting wood. But now he wasn't alone. Each morning, he found signs of hands that weren't his, a bundle of feed at the gate, nails left on the porch, a note scribbled on scrap paper. For the horses, don't stop. The barn itself transformed slowly into something more than shelter. With Thomas's steady hammer, Ava's careful guidance, and Lily's restless energy, they patched walls, replaced beams, and swept out years of dust. The space smelled of straw and smoke, alive with the rhythm of hooves. Juniper grew stronger with the foal at her side. Ash stood guard, Scar catching light like a badge. And the little one, Lily named him Valor without asking permission, galloped clumsily across the pen, each stumble followed by a stubborn rise. Caleb shook his head at the name, but secretly, it fit. The colt had been born into storms and had risen anyway. Visitors began to arrive. At first, just neighbors, curious to see the animals Caleb had nearly starved himself to save. Then families from town, children in boots too big, eyes wide as Valor nosed their hands. Lily filmed every visit, her videos carrying farther than she imagined. A woman from Santa Fe drove 3 hours after seeing one clip online, bringing her daughter who had stopped speaking after her father's death. The girl sat quietly against the fence until Valor trotted near, pressed his nose against her sleeve, and made her laugh for the first time in months. Ava caught Caleb watching from the corner, his hand over his mouth, his eyes wet. Word spread. This wasn't just a corral anymore. It was a refuge, a place where broken things, horses, land, people, were given the chance to keep breathing. Someone carved a sign and left it at the gate. Caleb sanded the rough edges and hung it himself. The words were simple, burned deep into the wood. Rio Grande, Mustang Haven. The name traveled faster than Caleb wanted. Reporters began calling. A photographer from Albuquerque asked to shoot Valor. Caleb refused them all, uneasy with attention. "This isn't a spectacle," he muttered to Lily. But when she showed him messages, letters from veterans who said Ash reminded them of their own survival, from children who begged their parents to visit, he understood this was bigger than his discomfort. Haven wasn't his alone anymore. At night, he sat on the porch with Lily beside him, the glow of her laptop casting light on her face. "They're asking if they can donate," she said. "If they can come help. If they can believe in this." Caleb listened, silent, while Ash's low rumble drifted from the barn and Juniper shifted in the straw. He thought of the years he had spent hiding from the world, burying his grief under chores. Now the world was reaching back, and against his nature, he found himself letting it. One evening, Thomas said what Caleb had been avoiding. "A haven doesn't survive on one man's will. It survives on community. Let them in, Brooks. That's how you keep Maddox out." Caleb said nothing. But later that night he wrote 3 words on a scrap of paper and tacked it above the barn door. "All are welcome." The valley did not soften. The cold still bit through every seam, and hunger still lingered at the edges. But the silence had changed. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It was filled with the sound of Valor's hooves, Lily's laughter behind her camera, Ava's calm instructions, Thomas's quiet songs, the sound of neighbors bringing what little they could, of children daring to smile. Caleb stood at the gate one night, lantern in hand, staring at the carved sign swinging in the wind. Haven. The word no longer felt like hope. It felt like fact. Late winter carried a brittle stillness across Mora Valley. Snow dusted the mesa tops, and nights fell heavy with silence. But inside the haven there was movement everywhere, valor growing taller by the week, Juniper regaining strength, Ash pacing the perimeter like a watchman who never rested. Caleb had settled into the rhythm. Feed before dawn, patching fences with Thomas through the day, Lily filming with a steadier hand than months before. It almost felt like life had taken root again. Almost. One morning, a convoy of government trucks appeared on the ridge, kicking up trails of frost and dust. They bore the emblem of the Bureau of Land Management. Caleb's heart tightened as he watched the vehicles roll down into the yard. A woman stepped out, clipboard under one arm, her parka zipped against the cold. She introduced herself as Ranger Collins. Her words were careful, professional, but they carried the weight of decision. "We've been tracking Mustang herds in Wyoming," she said. "We're reintroducing older stallions to stabilize the groups. Ash, he's a candidate. Strong, scarred, dominant enough to lead. It's the kind of life he was bred for." Caleb's throat closed. He looked at Ash, standing steady in the corral, ears flicked forward as though he understood every word. Freedom. The word rolled through Caleb's mind like a blade. Haven had given Ash safety, food, companionship. But was it enough for an animal born of wind and fire? Lily bristled instantly. "You can't just take him," she snapped, clutching her camera. "He's part of us." Colin's gaze softened. "I'm not here to force anything. It's a choice. But the wild isn't just where they came from. It's who they are." That night, Caleb walked the fence line alone. Snow squeaked under his boots, his breath clouding the air. Ash followed, as he always did, shadow at his shoulder. Caleb stopped near the gate and leaned against the rail, eyes burning in the cold. "I kept you alive," he murmured. "But maybe I've kept you from living too." The stallion snorted, breath curling white, and pressed his scarred shoulder lightly against Caleb's arm. It felt like both a thank you and a farewell. The next morning, neighbors gathered as word spread. Some argued he should keep Ash, that Haven needed its guardian. Others said freedom was the only true gift left to give. Caleb listened to them all, silent, until he raised his hand for quiet. "This place was built on sacrifice," he said simply. "It isn't about holding on. It's about giving back." When the trucks returned at dawn, the valley held its breath. Caleb stood with Ash in the corral, Lily beside him, Thomas and Ava just behind. He touched the stallion's neck one last time, forehead pressed to scar, and whistled the 2 short notes that had always brought Ash back. The stallion flicked his ears, exhaled, then stepped forward on his own, climbing the ramp with steady hooves. There was no struggle, only choice. Lily sobbed quietly, turning her camera aside. Caleb's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon where the trucks disappeared, dust trailing behind. His chest ached with emptiness, yet underneath it was something steadier than grief. Ash hadn't been taken. He had been set free. That evening, Caleb carved another line into the wooden sign at the gate. Beneath Rio Grande Mustang Haven, he etched words with a blunt knife. "Freedom lives here." When the lantern light hit the fresh grooves, It glowed as though the letters themselves were burning with quiet fire. He sat back, knife resting on his knee, and let the silence wash over him. Haven was still alive. Juniper with her foal, Valor running with wild legs, neighbors bringing offerings, Lily uploading her films, Thomas humming under the stars. Ash's absence hurt, but it also stretched the meaning of what they had built. A haven wasn't about keeping things caged. It was about giving them a place to begin again, even if that meant letting go. And in that moment, beneath a sky scattered with stars returned at last, Caleb realized the choice had never been his alone. Ash had chosen, too. Spring came slow to Mora Valley, like a hesitant traveler unsure if he was welcome. Snowmelt dripped from the mountains, trickling into the acequia that had been dry for too long. The water glistened under the sun, carving new paths through earth that had nearly forgotten its thirst. For Caleb, each shimmer was a reminder of storms endured, of paper rights reclaimed, of sacrifices that had shaped the haven into what it was now. Valor bounded through the pasture, his legs steadier, his coat darkening with youth. Juniper followed at a calmer pace, her belly no longer heavy, her stride once again her own. Children came on weekends, their laughter carried across the fields, their hands reaching timidly to brush the colt's soft muzzle. Lily filmed quietly, her lens capturing not spectacle, but the small, steady acts of healing. A boy smiling after weeks of silence, an old veteran resting his hand on Ash's empty stall, as though finding a piece of himself there. Ash's absence still cut deep. At night, Caleb sometimes whistled those two sharp notes into the dark, knowing there would be no answer. Yet when the wind carried faint echoes from the mesa, he let himself believe. Ash heard him, miles away among the wild herds, leading with scars that no longer chained him, but marked him as a survivor. Letting go had not closed the bond. It had stretched it across distance, tethered by memory and choice. The valley itself seemed to breathe again. Where flood had drowned, grass now sprouted. Where drought had cracked, roots found hold. Caleb worked the soil with hands rougher than ever, but he no longer carried the weight alone. Thomas was there, steady as the earth. Ava came often, not only as a vet, but as a friend who believed in what the haven had become. Neighbors still brought what little they could, not out of pity, but pride. They called it our haven now. One evening, Caleb sat by the acequia, the water rushing softly, carrying light from the fading sun. Lily joined him, her camera tucked away for once. She sat cross-legged, watching Valor chase his own shadow in the field. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Spending your last dollar that day?" Caleb chuckled, low and rough, shaking his head. "No. That was the first time in years I made a choice worth the cost." She leaned against his shoulder, and for a moment they simply listened to the water flow. The sound was steady, unbroken, carrying forward just as the haven would, long after both of them were gone. Caleb thought of his father, of his brother lost in the fire, of Ash vanishing into the wild. He thought of the foal breathing against his hands, fragile but determined. He thought of neighbors arriving with dry hands full of gifts, of strangers across the country who now believed in a place that had nearly been buried in silence. When the last light dipped, Caleb stood, brushing dust from his jeans. He walked to the gate where the wooden sign swayed gently. Rio Grande, Mustang Haven. Below it, the words he had carved in a moment of grief and hope. Freedom lives here. He ran his fingers across the grooves, feeling the truth of them deepen. Behind him, Valor whinnied, Juniper answering with a softer call. Lily laughed at the sound, her voice mixing with theirs. Caleb looked out at the horizon, where the river bent and disappeared into distance, and knew the story was no longer about one man, one farm, or even one herd. It was about what survived when everything else was taken. The water flowed, carrying time with it, and the haven stood, scarred, stubborn, alive. And in that quiet, Caleb whispered the same words that had begun it all, not for the horses or the valley, but for himself. You're safe now. And now, after all the storms and sacrifices, Haven still stands, scarred but alive. If this story touched you, drop a simple comment, even just a 0 or 1, to let us know you're here with us. Don't forget to subscribe, because more stories of hope, freedom, and the unbreakable bond between humans and horses are waiting for you in the next chapter.